Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook. Good Books Radio is produced by the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley as a public service to public radio and our community. With me today is Eleanor Payson. She is the author of a classic book, The Wizard of Oz and Other Narcissists, and she's educated countless readers with a step-by-step guide for learning to recognize and set boundaries with a narcissist family member, friend, spouse, or colleague. In her book that we're going to talk about today, Discovering the Healthy Self and Meaningful Resistance to Toxic Narcissism, Payson expands on the subject, enlightening readers with more understanding and strategies that empower individuals to deal more effectively with these toxic relationships. Ms. Payson, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
This is a powerful explanation and really helpful. And I would emphasize that although there's some great techniques and strategies in here, it is important for people who are dealing with someone who has the narcissistic personality disorder to get therapeutic support and or group support when they're dealing with that kind of relationship.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, that's the first step that I emphasize for anyone that might be, beginning to recognize that these dynamics are in play in their lives in whatever way, that they reach what I say endlessly outside the system, whether it's a spousal system or a family system or a business reality, outside the system, even if it's a social friendship network kind of experience, outside the system to get support and some validation and some of the much-needed narcissistic supplies, as we say, and I hope we can talk about that a little, because the person in these relationships is inevitably suffering from a depletion of these supplies that are so crucial to our basic health and well-being.
Very good. Now, the way I read this, and I think I'm understanding you, is that everybody has a little bit of narcissism. That doesn't mean that they have NPD. So let's talk about narcissistic supplies and how they contribute to a healthy self.
Sure, absolutely. I'd like to back up to that first comment just to say that one of the reasons I think there is so much confusion about healthy narcissism versus unhealthy narcissism, or traits versus starting to reach towards toxic narcissism and then ultimately full NPD or malignant narcissism, where we have sociopathy involved as well. The whole continuum, we get confused because, and I think this helps audience, the layperson, begin to get a better handle, is that healthy narcissism is simply the equivalent of healthy self-esteem. Mm-hmm. And healthy self-esteem is simply the ability to regulate our sense of self-worth and value and have resilience in the world. That's what healthy self-esteem is. So healthy narcissism is literally the equivalent of that. So narcissistic supplies are crucial to that reality for all of us. We need these healthy exchanges with others in our world, particularly, of course, the developing child, but we all need healthy amounts of narcissistic supplies that we exchange with other loved ones or friends or valued colleagues. And so the narcissistic supplies are these sort of verbal and nonverbal exchanges that offer us a sense of our connection, our belonging, which is twinship. Mm-hmm. And that's 1/3 of the pie. And my book kind of hopefully conveys an easy-to-understand description of these aspects of narcissistic supplies, which were originally identified, by the way, by a man named Heinz Kohut, who was a very famous psychoanalyst who developed his theories about the developing self in the mid-20th century. And he identified these narcissistic supplies at first in their unhealthy versions in his analysis work. And he began to really put some shape to what is so crucial to our experience of self-worth and resilience. So twinship is one of those. That's where we feel a sense of belonging and somebody else is just experiencing something similar to us, maybe not identical, but who can relate to us and say, wow, I understand what that feels like.
Mm-hmm. You say in the book that each one of us has a vital need to know that there are universal experiences that we share with other human beings, and that's sort of at the foundation of twinship, isn't it?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. That's exactly, and that's why the word twinship, as in being born as a twin, we inherently get to have a little being that is experiencing the world similarly to us, and having similar type feelings to similar type experiences. So it's very powerful in our sense of knowing that we're not alone, that we're connected, that we have a sense of belonging, and that there's a kind of universally shared connection that we have.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the admiration, idealization, the second.
Yes,
nutrient.
And so the second third of the pie is admiration, idealization, which now is the exchange of celebrating our uniqueness, our individuality, our one-of-a-kind experience of self, that we're like a snowflake. We're literally one of a kind. And when we pursue our unique visions, our ambitions, our likes, and we express our dislikes, we are expressing our individuality and our uniqueness. And so if the child or the adult is in relationships where they're being affirmed, is the kind of mature adult version of admiration and idealization, affirmed and respected and recognized, acknowledged, appreciated, valued. These are forms of the admiration, idealization side of the equation. And they're very important. And then the last third is the mirroring, validation, and empathy, which is sort of the communication, the communion that we employ to convey both our twinship, our differences, and navigate the journey, the big adventure, so to speak, of our multiplicity in the world with other people. And they're very key to, they're kind of like oil in the machine that allows us to communicate who we are and understand who others are and convey that we respect that we appreciate that we can empathize.
Now, in both idealization and mirroring, we get a clue to how important our parent figures are. That idealization is to trust in those powerful people who protect us when we're fragile and vulnerable when we're young. And mirroring is a common technique taught in active listening.
Yes, it can be a very verbal and intentional sort of skill of listening and sharing, but also in terms of the infant and the toddler, there's a lot of mirroring and exchange that goes on in a very nonverbal way. That's sort of like the gleam in the parent's eye when they see the child come home from school, and just give them a wonderful welcome, an unconditional welcome, before hopefully launching into what did you learn at school today. But which is sort of, we need these supplies in both unconditional and conditional ways, and hopefully a balance to some degree of that.
Yeah. Now, parents have their own narcissistic wounding, but they also affect the narcissistic wounding of the child, impeding the child's ability to internalize knowing that they're good or trustworthy or special. And that's sort of where we go next in terms of the development of the child.
Yes, and so the more self-aware a parent is, the more the parent is even just simply consciously trying to be a good parent, even if they're not necessarily educating themselves or, working on themselves, even if they're just trying to do it better than their parents did it with them. There is an inevitable progression towards a better generation. But of course, we can enhance that trying so powerfully if we do work on self-awareness and on offloading some of our own wounding and our own defenses. We can be so much better at parenting and preventing the transmission of wounding, if you will. And so, yes, the parents' blind spots and defense structures that have remained unacknowledged or unaddressed are going to be the form of transmission of wounding, really, with the next generation, that person's child.
Mm-hmm. You have a good brief summary of developmental psychology in here in the foundational stages of development, and you cite Freud's claim, show me the boy of 7 and I'll show you the man. Let's talk about those first 3 stages in particular, the attachment stage from 0 to 18 months, and then the separation stage, and then the identity stage.
Sure. That quote is the very famous quote from Freud, and it really kind of is so famous because even though it has the gender, exclusion aspect to it, it's very true that the foundational and critical stages of the human being's existence are those first 7 years, and so much is the foundation is so critical to what will allow that child to have resilience and to work on continued growth or unfortunately not. And the first 3 stages in particular are where the foundation of the core self, as they say, is being laid. And that is also the first stage. The first stage is where the adaptations of people with personality disorders who are being maybe wounded at a very, very early age, not getting enough narcissistic supplies, getting too much of the wrong kind of selective narcissistic supplies alongside not enough, and or just actual out-and-out wounding, critical parent, a very harsh parent. So any variation on these themes are going to create a child that has to adapt with defense structures that unfortunately all too often become embedded in the personality of the child and very, very honed, so that by the time a child, I'm kind of taking this a little further, if you don't mind, into the
Sure.
personality disorder reality, which is by the time the person with a narcissistic personality disorder or other personality disorders is an adult, they're so honed and developed in their defense structures or adaptations that are basically compensations for having a very fragile, insecure sense of self. But they're so good that they tend to work so well that they're often lifelong, and there's often very little awareness that they exist and that they are actually powerfully limiting that person from being healthy and fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. So if we look at the wounding and what comes out of that, either the narcissistic personality disorder or the codependent neurotic issues, can you, in a sentence or two, talk about each of those and what they look like, what they appear to be?
The sort of adult manifestation of the two categories?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So in both my books, I try to, as much as possible, simplify it. And with the continuum in my first book, I have kind of a continuum of what I call healthy neurotic to all character disorder or personality disorder, to demonstrate that the codependent neurotic, which is my terminology for the less wounded but still has an insecure sense of self, that can powerfully debilitate the person if they don't get help, and can often attract that person towards somebody who is even less well, and therefore that person can ultimately kind of become less well themselves as they sort of stay in a homeostasis of dysfunction with somebody with a personality disorder. But the character disorder, the personality disordered individual has very limited or little sense of true self, and very little capacity to observe themselves with any independent ability to acknowledge, and look at themselves objectively, particularly with a desire to work on the self or to acknowledge errors and work towards progress. there's very little energy or consciousness available to the person with personality disorder to do this. So the observing self is impaired. There is, on the emotional level, very little capacity for empathy, and that includes very little capacity for genuine empathy of self. Interestingly enough, and ironically, the narcissist has very little true capacity for empathizing with themselves. They're highly sensitive and highly reactive, but very little capacity to actually maturely empathize with self. And conversely, very little capacity, of course, to empathize with others. So there's a severe impairment, sometimes extreme impairment, we might say, in the NPD's ability to empathize. And then finally, there can be real impairment with self-regulation, regulation of impulses and behaviors, and which often sort of make people with personality disorders quite prone to addictions and of all kinds. And so, in fact, we might say, actually, that the narcissistic personality disorder, specifically as a personality disorder, is actually addicted to narcissistic supplies in such a way that they're not actually making mature use of them, but they are addicted to them.
And they use inauthentic ways to get to those supplies, don't they?
Exactly. Sometimes. I mean, sometimes, like, for instance, a high-functioning narcissist who might be a brain surgeon or a very, very talented artist of any kind, or very accomplished, the high-functioning, sometimes called structured narcissist by an expert that I quote in my book, they're getting their narcissistic supplies of admiration and appreciation through very real-world accomplishments. The lower-functioning narcissist is often inevitably getting them through, as you say, inauthentic means, more through the simple sheer force of their personality or the wily ways of their personality, maybe the charmer or sadly, in our state of Michigan, we've got the MSU scandal that is just reaching unbelievable dimensions. Even yesterday, I don't know if you've heard,
no.
But new terrible information coming out. But where a whole system gets sort of diseased, if you will, by narcissistic individuals who have sociopathic dimensions and so very inauthentic ways of getting their narcissistic supplies met. Yeah.
So you talked about the structured and unstructured narcissist, but let's distinguish the overt and the covert behaviors as well, please.
Sure. The overt is the person who's more obvious. So therefore, in a way, there's always trade-offs, but in a way, the overt is a little easier to spot, at least now, and as people are becoming more aware of what narcissistic disturbance actually looks like. The overt is easier to spot because they're kind of, spotlight hogs, if you will, and needing to kind of dominate the conversation, the corporate meeting, whatever. So that's the more overt narcissistic person, but the covert is probably a little bit more dangerous because they are very expert at feigning an appearance of being interested in others. The charmer, the con artist, the sociopathic. We'll just stay with MSU. Dr. Nasser, very covert narcissist, sociopath. Appears as though they're really these good, upstanding people, but anything but, really. So the covert narcissist is a bit more dangerous and has a much greater capacity to, I think, gaslight, which is to cause other people to doubt their realities and be very effective at that. So when you get a high-functioning narcissist who's a covert narcissist, particularly high-functioning, you have a pretty scary situation. That could be a therapist, too. Could be a minister, could be... so the outer appearance is as if they're very other-oriented and helpful to others when actually it's simply a persona that is uncovering a deeper disturbance.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned gaslighting, which is from the classic movie. I think it might be useful to look at the adult codependent neurotic and how they are drawn like a moth to the flame to someone with NPD.
Right. Yes, and that's a good movie for everybody to watch, isn't it? It's such a classic. But yes, I use perhaps old-fashioned terms that are being upgraded all the time as these realities are becoming more in the common culture and awareness. But neurotic is a term that is certainly indicating that intrapsychically. So I use the word codependent to kind of identify the outer behaviors. Codependency term coming from the field of addiction and the recognition that family members try to become helpers to the person with addiction, trying to rescue them, trying to help them see the light and get away from the drug or whatever the addiction is. And so the family members or chief codependent in those systems becomes very much involved in the problem in an unhealthy way in terms of their behaviors. They begin to actually enable the problem, very unwittingly, of course, but nonetheless, it's a common and inevitable dynamic until the person gets some outside help. But the term neurotic is meant to identify the inner state of the person's psychology who are in these relationships typically. I want to say also an exception to that rule is sometimes two people with personality disorders that are somewhat complementary can get together, and it's not always, a personality disorder attracting a codependent, but I'd say the vast majority, that's the case. So the codependent actually has more capacity to get well, but again, the caveat being that only if they reach outside the system and get some objective help, as you mentioned earlier, with a therapist or a support group or beginning to get some education. Just get outside the system to begin to get those much-needed narcissistic supplies from healthy people that will begin to help the person have kind of get off the starvation edge of the cliff and begin to feel more grounded.
Very good.
Less crazy.
Yeah. So let's talk about the 4 stages of recovery. They are awareness, preparation for change, empowerment, and letting go. Let's start with the awareness stage, claiming self as the center of initiative. What needs to happen there?
Right. So the 4 stages are meant to indicate just roughly the sort of progression. It's not always sequential, of course, and there can be a back and forth quality to the stages, but of course, every aspect of change has to start with awareness. There is not going to be change, really, that sustains anyway without awareness. So that becomes usually possible as somebody begins to open up to new information and new insight into what they've been dealing with and beginning to understand why they're always so unhappy and, in fact, why they're getting worse. So gaining some awareness, since my first book came out, it's just been incredible how much there's been an acceleration of awareness about narcissistic disturbance and its counterpart of codependency. It's just incredible. Mm-hmm. And so people can literally Google a question now and begin to get the term and then start to track more information. But to begin the actual work on self, the good news about codependency and neurosis, is that there's enough awareness for the person to actually make good use of it and to begin to recognize some of the boundary violations that are going on, to begin to see that they're kind of weak in the codependent is rather weak in their capacity to claim their own initiative, their own rights, and assert that. And so these 3 aspects of continuing to work with a greater development of one's observing self, beginning to work with setting limits on boundary violations, and even learning that there are such a thing as healthy boundaries and unhealthy boundaries. That's very much in our cultural awareness, I think, now.
Yeah, and I like the self-statements there in claiming the self. I deserve better treatment. I will create a better life for myself. I will not allow myself to be mistreated. I am doing something positive about my life, and I deserve help. The recognition of where the boundaries are is really important in that. That's some powerful self-statements that I probably will practice outside of this interview. I appreciate those.
Well, good. Yeah, we do need to continue to work with awareness of our own interactions in our lives and how they're, discerning how they're going and make our choices accordingly. And with the more we are aware of what's in our own best interest, and that generally, I encourage people, because I say they often, codependents in recovery often say, "Oh, well, I'm being selfish. I'm afraid I'm being selfish." Well, generally, when we actually do something that is right and good and wholesome for ourselves, it's inevitably good and right and wholesome to some degree for whoever else we're discerning that question about. Because it's not helpful or healthy to enable another person's lack of awareness and hurtful behavior. That's not helpful.
Very good. So we have about 4 minutes left, but I want to go through these stages. So in the preparation for change stage, one of the most powerful tools you talk about is creating assertiveness scripts, and that's so important. I teach assertiveness in my conflict classes, and it's based in part on a book that's 30 years old called "When I Say No, I Feel Guilty," but you cite some other assertiveness books too. And so, what are the ways to get assertiveness scripts into your head?
Well, I can't remember. I don't have the reference right in front of me, but in my book I cite it. An old, several decades old author that identified the DESC, D-E-S-C script.
Mm-hmm. DESC, that's good,
acronym, which helps us remember that there is a sequence, there is kind of a script structure that is extremely helpful, but I also make some adaptations in my book, because I think when you're dealing with a strongly narcissistic person, the average assertiveness scripts are going to collapse like a paper in the wind. Mm-hmm. There has to be a much stronger grounding in the scripts, and along with greater rehearsal. So, and some support systems that can help us troubleshoot our enactment of them and how they went and what we would tweak. And so it's an ongoing work in progress, I guess, for especially codependents to develop assertiveness.
Mm-hmm. And the empowerment stage, when you begin to set limits, actually walk away from a discussion when the NPD won't take it in the direction you want it to go. Yeah,
that's so important. That is the ultimate sort of use, the actual enactment, the actual experiential practicing, and then getting better and better at it and learning that there are always so many more possibilities than we realize, because the narcissist is inevitably seeking the reactive trigger in us. Like a heat-seeking missile, that's what they're looking for, is to create a destabilizing, disorienting experience to get the person sort of off balance, and then start to use persuasion or intimidation to instill the doubt, which codependents have a terrible, predisposition towards in the first place. And so it's so important to learn how to neutralize those dynamics.
Mm-hmm. And then in the letting go section, you talk a little bit about forgiveness being more than a spiritual practice. The process of healing involves letting go of outmoded beliefs and gaining confidence in yourself. What would you say in one sentence about forgiveness, which is unfair to you, but I know.
It's a process, and it's initially about letting go so one can grow. Even if it's about stepping back and creating more space, letting go of the old dynamics or beginning to step away from them and get outside help to look at the process and change the process. Mm-hmm. There's so much more to it, of course,
yes.
because that it's a powerful aspect of our lives.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been talking with Eleanor Payson. The book is Discovering the Healthy Self and Meaningful Resistance to Toxic Narcissism. I'm convinced, based upon this book and our conversation, that I need to go back to her first book, The Wizard of Oz and Other Classic Narcissists. Both books are available in print and paperback. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't catch our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can also catch us on YouTube. The YouTube channel is Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.